You're listening to Do That Well with your hosts, Brenda Brown and Karen Thrall, a podcast about real experiences and how to turn them into life lessons. Unscripted, honest, funny, genuine, and passionate. A series of conversations where we explore every aspect of human interaction and provoke each other to do life well. For those of you that have been listening weekly, and we hope you are, we last week talked about how it is now Black History Month, the month of February. And as a continuation to celebrate Black History Month, Karen and I are going to share a couple Black people that we find inspiring and essentially just talk about them and and talk about how
Yeah.
amazing they are in the hopes that this is some new information to you all and that you'll also get to learn alongside us.
Mhm. I think they're great role models too, as well. And I think they have that legendary thing about them. So it's something that they're, like you just said, we're adding them, they'll be added to the history pages as well.
I tend to agree,
Yeah.
Karen.
Yeah.
So today I'm going to start by sharing with Karen some information about an individual who will not quite yet be named. I'll get there. Um, and so this is a person that actually recently passed away this year in January, on January 18th, and their name is André Leon Talley. And he is a Black man that is very well known for essentially being a wave maker and really just influential figure within the fashion industry, predominantly. So, first off, I'm just curious, Karen, do you know who Andre Leon Talley is?
I know of, and that's about it.
Okay, so
I know fashion Andre. There we go. But I can't wait to learn more.
so I will admit that honestly, when I saw that he had passed away last month, I did know who he was. I knew that he had been affiliated with Vogue. I knew that he had been on America's Next Top Model,
Mhm.
and much like yourself, Karen, I knew that he was associated, with fashion within the fashion world. But I actually personally did not know how much of a figurehead he was within that space until I started researching more and reading more about his life, and gathering more information. So just right off the bat, I kind of want to bring up, like, going off of the conversation we had in our last episode, even just in that, you can see how, this person just passed away last month. So we had this like living legend and
Mhm.
this influential person within the fashion space. And even then, I don't know that his praises were sung as like wide and far as they may have been had he been a person of a different color. Now that is
Mhm.
just like an assumption that I'm making. I'm not I'm not basing that in any reality. These are just like my feelings about it, but I think that is eye-opening just for me as
Mhm.
an individual, for me to
Mhm.
be like, wow, I didn't even know how influential this human is, and this is like current history.
Yeah.
So I just
Mhm.
wanted to bring that to the
Mhm.
table.
That's great because that you saying that triggered a thought in me about the whole educating us, and who would have thought that in Black History Month we'd be educated in the area of fashion. We usually think civil rights, or we naturally go to those big heroes, Martin Luther King Jr. But we're in the fashion industry, and history has been made there as well. So we're getting educated even in these parts of the United States, and being an American are very important. Fashion is a big thing for us in the United States. So
Right. So as I mentioned, he sadly did pass away last month at the age of 73. So we lost a great one last month. But Andrew Leon Talley. He was an American fashion journalist, stylist,
Oh.
creative director, and he was the editor at large of Vogue magazine for quite a long time.
Mm.
He was born in Washington, D.C., and went to Brown University, where he actually studied French literature, which I find very
Wow.
interesting because, like,
Yeah.
what a leap to take from, studying French literature. Originally, he intended to teach. He was going to teach French
Mm.
and, or French in French, about
Yeah.
French literature. And then he found himself making this, you know, illustrious career in fashion. So I find that interesting.
Mm. Mm. So has literature always been a passion of his?
Yeah,
Like, so
definitely.
that's something that kind of led him into Vogue. I would think like that passion for literature moved him into fashion.
Yeah, exactly. I think that passion for literature then was what led him to, be a journalist and write. And then
Mm.
as he continued on that path, he eventually found this niche that really worked for him within the fashion world.
Mm.
So after he graduated from school, he did an internship. Um, and I won't get into all of the specifics because there's a lot of information. So if you're interested, I highly encourage you to look further into it. But we'll just leave it at he did an internship. And when he was doing this internship, he caught the eye of an editor at Vogue at the time, who then offered to get him writing, essentially. So that was sort of his leg in the door, um, which is so funny, or not funny, that's not the right word, but I find it interesting because, again, he was studying French literature, then just via having friends that were like, hey, do this internship. He just kept carving his way until he found himself in this little, again, niche of fashion, and editorial fashion specifically. But it makes me think about the conversations that you and I, Karen, have had about different seasons and chapters of our lives, and how all these things that we do in their life it's all a chapter, and it's all going to somehow apply to whatever that next chapter in your life is going to be. So
Mhm.
when I think of his journey, and as you said, there's like this literature through line, but you can see how in the end it was all getting him to that place, right? So
Mhm.
I find that very
Mhm.
inspirational
Mhm.
personally.
And it also reminds you to stay on that path because you don't like. Let's say he decided to do I don't know, get a job as a chef or get a job running a dog kennel, like something very, very contrary to his passion. That those are detours, but somehow he stayed true to what he was naturally designed for, and it started with writing. It
Right.
started with literature, and it just is encouraging for all of us to remember whatever that thing is inside you, stay on that path so that doors can open up.
Definitely.
So yeah, a
Yeah,
good example of that.
exactly. And that's why, this isn't even a big part of his story of who he is as an
Yeah.
individual, but I find that there is inspiration in that, as well, just to as a reminder to ourselves to, like, as you said, stay on that path, don't give up, really, really follow those passions, and talk to people that you know about those passions too, because it was his friends and his acquaintances and these connections that he had that eventually got him to where he was meant to be.
Mm.
So with that aside, Vogue. So he was the magazine's fashion news director from 83 to 87. And then he was the first African American male creative director from 1988 to 1995. And then he was the magazine Vogue's editor at large from 1998 to 2013. So he worked for Vogue for the better part of 3 decades, which is a very long time. And as I just said, there were a lot of firsts there for him. He was the first Black person to hold these roles at this company. So that in and of itself is a big deal. And, definitely then paved the way for there to be other people, Black people, and other people of color in those roles at the magazine. I also want to mention that he was 6'6", so he was also like a very just domineering presence. But from what I have been able to ascertain, it seems that his personality was just as big, and it just made for him being, a very big presence that a lot of people just enjoyed being around. So I think he was very charismatic in that way.
That's so great.
Um,
So great.
but when he entered into the fashion world, this would have been the late 70s when he was first interning and things like that, and first being within the fashion industry. And at that time, the fashion world in America specifically was still very predominantly white. So he really stood out within that industry,
Mm.
not only for the fact that he wasn't a white person, but he was also just physically large.
Yeah.
So people
Wow.
knew him. And he was oftentimes the only Black person that would be in the front row at all of these fashion shows as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I had to do something because I didn't. You're right. You didn't share any of your notes with me, so I did a quick peek.
Oh,
Because you got me curious about. So I found a quote from him,
yeah.
and it fits here. And it fits here because I literally, okay, people listening, I literally did it in her introduction while you were recording the intro, because I went, oh, because I had this question. Oh, I wonder, and then you just kind of led into my question.
Oh,
You
perfect.
know, being the only black man, black person, possibly 6'6". It was predominantly a white industry, white people industry in the 70s. And my question was, had he ever experienced prejudice? So I found this quote, and I think this would be a great place because even someone with his charisma, his charm, his intelligence, his education, his experience, everything, he too still experienced prejudice.
Right.
And he said, I have experienced racism all my life, as any black man does. It shows that even in the glamorous world of fashion, there is racism. And so you think about how he also was forerunning tearing that down.
Hmm.
Like he was a forerunner in the fashion industry to help tear down the walls of prejudice and racism.
Right.
He
Yes.
was just doing his job. He was being
Hmm.
himself. He was doing what he loves to do. Yet there was this also side purpose that he didn't ask. It found him.
Right.
He'd found him, and I thought so. I just had to share that because that was my big question. And okay, so keep going.
So I actually love that you brought up that quote just now, because I also had a quote that I wanted to
Okay.
bring up now, and I think that is a perfect, they go really well together. So to touch on what you were saying, Karen, yes, he did still face some adversity and some, prejudice within the fashion world, and he was very aware of the fact that he was setting an example. And there was a documentary called The Gospel According to Andre. And in that documentary, he says, you don't get up and say, look, I'm Black and I'm proud. You just do it and it impacts the culture.
Mm,
And I really liked that quote, because I just think it's a really nice sentiment. I like that he's, showing in that he is aware of what he's doing. He's aware that just by his presence being in that space, it's going to have an impact and it's going to impact the culture. But I also like that he's saying, I don't need to be out here with my hands waving saying, look, I'm Black and I'm proud. He knows that just by merely having his presence there, that it's impactful. And I think that is so powerful that he was that aware, of what just him being there was bringing to that space.
mhm, mhm. Interesting. You should say that because this week, like in real time, and while like just the days building leading up to this recording, I have been reflecting on that quiet presence. Sometimes, sometimes you don't have to say anything, but don't lose your power, don't lose your confidence. Just let yourself be in the moment, be in where you are, and allow that to be the shining example instead of, because or me us many of us, we're quick to be defensive. And listening to what you just said, Andre, he didn't take that position. He took a position of proactive or confidence or just action,
Hmm.
So I think that's really cool.
Uh, yeah, I agree, Karen. I really like that the confidence, as you just said. I think that's a really good word for it. Just the fact that he was secure enough in himself
Secure enough.
to just show up and be, and he knew that it was having an impact. He knew he was setting an example, but he was secure in that. So I think
Hmm.
that's really, again, I just find that very inspirational.
Hmm. Love to be a fly on the wall and listen to his conversations. It was the 70s, 80s, 90s,
Yes,
2000s. And
definitely.
boy, I'd love to hear him at dinner parties with his closest friends talking about the influence that continued to build in him and build in him, just steadily, consistently growing, year after year, and what he saw, what he witnessed, what he experienced.
Right. And because there was so much change that happened in those years,
Yeah,
just as a society, and then was
yeah,
specifically within fashion as well. So I bet those were, I would also
mhm,
love to be a fly on the wall
yeah,
of those
yeah.
conversations. I'm sure it was very interesting.
Mhm.
So he also was really well known for advocating for other people within the fashion space that were people of color. Um, just to name a few, he was one of the very first people, or he was the first person, excuse me, to ever write about the designer LaQueen Smith and other designers of color. He styled American tennis player Serena Williams in his designs. He introduced Michelle Obama to a Taiwanese Canadian designer, Jason Wu. You might have heard of him, maybe. Uh, so he Tally definitely was out there advocating for other people of color to be in the fashion space, and he used his influence to continue to further those names that were smaller that now are quite big. So another thing that's not necessarily specific to him being a black person, but I did find this interesting, was in 2007 he was ranked 45th in Out magazine's 50 most powerful gay men and women in America. So
And what year was that?
in 2007.
2007.
So I thought that this was just an
Mm,
interesting
mm,
supplemental point or factoid about his
mm,
life, because not only was he out there being a forerunner as a black man achieving all of these firsts within the editorial world at Vogue, but he was also very influential because he was a gay man. So
mm,
he has this very layered uh
mhm.
just
But yeah, it's
who he
like
was.
right, and it's the first. He has. Who would have thought when he was little he'd be a forerunner, that he would be leading the way by just being himself.
Right. Mm.
It's very exciting to hear what he did silently, or well, maybe not silently, but what he did. He wasn't silent. There was no way, but
No, but I know what you mean.
yeah,
It wasn't necessarily silent, but he he wasn't overt either,
right,
right?
right. Yeah,
So, and I do think there's something to be said for that. I know that we've talked about this idea of the quiet achiever in some
right.
of our other
Yeah,
podcast episodes that we've done. And again, I don't think he was silent or quiet necessarily, but
right.
it still evokes that same sentiment, I think, personally. Just the sense that, again, because he wasn't out there shouting from the rooftops, he wasn't super overt about any of this. And so um yes, there is a little bit of a quiet achiever
It
underneath.
just reminds you that like it's something we can all aspire as well as in your own life. where are you a quiet achiever, and don't underestimate its power.
Right.
Don't underestimate that you're coming in under the ranks. Like, he was in the top 50, not the top 5.
Right.
He was in the top 50, so he was in there in this melting pot of 50 most powerful leaders, and but his legacy, because of that quiet achiever with a big personality.
So I know we are starting to reach the end of our episode, but I just have a couple other things I wanted to share about André Leon Talley real quickly. So this is just a fun thing, but he was very well known for having and wearing extravagant like capes and caftans and robes. It was a bit of his signature look, uh, which I just think is really fun because again, it goes along with this idea of this like 6'6" man that's just like
Right.
a big presence, and he's wearing these really like lavish capes and robes and caftans and just being such a unique individual. And I just think that there's so much to be celebrated in that, regardless of what color or race you are,
Mhm. Mhm.
because
Mhm.
there's just something to be celebrated for being yourself and
Yeah.
for just being
Yeah.
authentic and not
Yeah.
worrying about what other people are, you know, going to think. So I just think that that tidbit just gives you a little bit more information about like who he was and the confidence that he had.
Okay, and how successful, like, he wore extravagant clothing, and it didn't minimize his success.
Right.
We can be very apologetic as a culture, a self-apologetic, where I'm sorry, I'm this, I'm sorry, I look like this, or whatever, and this is another shout out to all of us. The more you just be the expression of who you are, I think it's more freeing, and you more opportunities open up because people recognize authentic. They recognize it. They're drawn to it. It's the real thing. You're not going to fool me. Like, you're the real deal, and people are really drawn to that. So this is very inspiring for all of us to remember. Just, you can really truly be yourself, and allow yourself to create wonderful success for your life.
Hmm. Exactly. So one more thing, and then I
Okay.
will wrap up. As I mentioned earlier, Andre Leon Talley was a judge on America's Next Top Model. And there was a particular cycle, season that he was in where there was a black model who had done one of the shoots, and her poses that she had chose were getting a lot of negative feedback from the other judges on the show. And when it was Andre's turn to say something about the photos, he went against what all the other judges had been saying and was like, actually, I think this is really beautiful. And, here's my X, Y, and Z reasons why. But the reason that that's important is because America's Next Top Model, up until that point, had kind of had a bit of a reputation for the judges being pretty harsh. And they, in that particular episode, none of the other models had really received harsh judgment. It was only this black model that had been receiving harsh judgment. And by Andre Leon Talley saying a more positive thing and really actually encouraging these choices that this black model had made, it in a way paved a new era of like
Mm.
feedback from the judges, because he would always really like lead with kindness, and sometimes he had negative feedback, but he was always very constructive with the way that he would present it. He was really on the model's side, and formerly a lot of judges weren't that way. So that was also cool too, that when he was a judge on America's Top Model, he was only there for, what was it, 4 seasons, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, he was on the show for 4 seasons, and in that time he brought like a different energy to the show that it didn't have before, where he was more like with the models and would really advocate for them, especially when they were models that were persons of color. So I think that's really cool too, this idea that he from what I can surmise, it seemed like he was the kind of individual that would really lead with like kindness. um, Obviously I don't know him personally, this is all just via what I've read on the internet, but it seems like I've had a hard time finding very much negative stuff about him. It seems like he was really a person that brought a lot of good energy into the world. So,
And there's a good lesson too. He is so comfortable in his, so confident in his lens, and his lens was very empowering. And he could have been the only one that disagreed. He could have adjusted himself and softened it just so that he could be in alignment with his fellow judges. But he in his quiet confidence and being so comfortable in himself, he was able to go against the grain.
right.
And that going against the grain empowered another woman to excel, and then adapt and change actually how the judging the models continued on. So there's this thing about it's a ripple effect.
Mm-hmm.
The more you're comfortable in yourself, the more have this quiet confidence, this quiet self-assuredness. You're in alignment with the things like that are so important to you. All of a sudden, you're paying it forward and
Right.
you're giving it away to other people, and it's going to be really powerful. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Uh, this was my little mini history lesson on Andre Leon Talley. But I just wanted to end by saying, for me, what I think is really uh, cool, I don't know, for lack of a better word, we'll just go with cool. What I think is really cool about learning more about Andre and reading more about, his contribution to society, is that you can see that there are all of these other ways, and we've talked about them in this last half hour. There's all these other ways that he was just a very inspirational human, right? Like, yes, he had some cool things that he did, and he had some things that he did as far as making strides within Black history, being the first Black man that was the, editor in chief at Vogue, so on and so forth. But in addition to that, there were just all of these amazing traits that he possessed as a human, regardless of anything else, just human, right? That are really inspirational and, in my opinion, are really admirable and things that I would hope to see myself do more of in my own life, like this quiet confidence, this idea that when you stay true to what it is you love, your passion, that you can find yourself going through these different chapters but landing in a place that you're meant to be, right? There are all these other parts of his life that I think are so inspirational that are not necessarily tied to the fact that he was a Black man. So I think that's really, really fascinating and very cool.
I do too. And that is the whole Black History Month, is the pages, the history pages are interwoven into all of our pages.
Right.
That's what, last week, that was really what stuck out for me, was all these history pages belong to me.
Hmm.
They all belong. They're all woven together. And this is another example of it.
Exactly.
Has nothing to do with the color of his skin.
No, he just was an amazing individual.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And we get to honor him during Black History Month.
and always.
Yeah, and always. Yeah.
So that is my episode for you today. Thank you for bearing with me, Karen. I know that I
That was
gave you
great.
no prep.
No notes.
I was just like, I'm going to tell you about this person.
Oh man, it was great though. Thank you. Really, I loved it. And next week's my turn. So I've got somebody that I'd love to talk about next week.
Yes, the tables will be turned. I won't know what's going on.
I know.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening. And as always, we'll be back next week with another episode of Do That Well.
Bye bye.